It's the right Rican, and I am happy today. I have Michael Johns. He is a leading conservative and a thought leader and activist. He served. He's a big person on my show today. He was a White House speechwriter and a senior aide for a senator and a governor. And also he's worked in the Heritage Foundation, and in 2009 he helped start the Tea Party movement, which is, as most of you people know, was a big grassroots movement that sparked quite controversy in the news media for no reason. But and he has also written for the Wall Street Journal, the Christian Science Monitor, and he also appears on as an analyst and commentator on different shows around the U.S. and around the world, and also on radio networks. And happy to have him on my show here today. Thanks for coming, Michael.
Good to be with you. Thanks.
So, to have you on as an analyst, my big question to you, my first question would be, we have had, 8-9 months of Joe Biden. What do you think is his worst decision that he's made so far as president?
Well, the two big ones are the border and the openness of it, and the short and long-term effects that's going to have on the country. And then, of course, the complete surrender of Afghanistan to the Taliban, and the impact that's going to have on U.S. security interests and on human rights of Afghans. Those two seem to me to be monstrous. Now, I think you could probably put a third in there, and that's our energy policy.
Oh,
just recently, I'm seeing this Sinopec in China is announcing, they're drilling record amounts of petroleum, taking up the lax position that we've taken under Biden, with him discontinuing Keystone and so many other components of our petroleum. I mean, so the fact is, you cannot really, at the end of the day, immediately alter demand for these energy sources. And when you simultaneously put in unilateral impediments to our own ability as America to produce them, they're simply going to come from other countries. And that's the unfortunate reality, is that we're now seeing, China and Russia, two fairly adversarial, very adversarial, I would say, powers in the world, that are direct beneficiaries of these energy policies that we put in place. But look, I'm very torn about the first two issues. I mean, number one, we have millions of Americans not in the labor force, many not incentivized to return to the labor force because of the fiscal policies of Biden. And there are so many compelling reasons that we need to secure this border. Number one, national security, right? Yeah. I mean, the 9/11 was. The governor that you cited that I worked for also went on to chair the 9/11 Commission, and one of the primary conclusions of that report was the need to cease overstayed visas. By that, the 9/11 Commission meant you got to control who comes in and out of the country. When you have a big, wide open gap, and you're essentially welcoming all comers. These aren't even just Latin Americans anymore. We've got China, Africa, other areas of Asia.
People don't talk about like the Eastern Europeans that come here. That they usually fly here, and then they come and then they overstay their visas, which we never pursue them.
Well, we're one of the few countries that has no real in-place mechanism for doing that. So if you arrive on, say, a 180-day visa, on day 181, we have no idea where you are. And I can't tell you how many times I've jumped in a cab in New York City, and you start talking to somebody about where they're from. I'm from Bangladesh. I'm like, how'd you end up in Manhattan? I flew here, 10 years ago and never left.
Yeah.
And we have a system that's been put in place. I don't believe it's an accident or an oversight. It's been a conscious design and a conscious area of neglect by both parties.
Yes.
And I think that the line of reasoning has been that, Democrats view them as voters down the line, Chamber of Commerce type Republicans, or, industry itself benefits from lower wages, which means you increase the labor pool, you deflate the wages. That's kind of economics 101. The supply goes up and the amount you have to pay goes down. And
yeah, I think it's funny you say both parties, because you look at what happened with the Haitians, that Biden wants to deport back the Haitians. And I think it's funny because Haitians tend to vote Republican because of their, they got screwed over by the Clinton Foundation, and they don't forget it. Because I know a bunch of Haitians.
They do, yeah. Actually, there's no doubt about that. That's another sort of untied, uninvestigated scandal that hangs over the Clintons that we've never really taken seriously. But you talk to any Haitian who was close to any of that relief effort, and they have grave concerns about how that money was allocated. And there's a long books that could be written about that, about the entire Clinton Foundation. I mean,
yes.
It really was set up as a pay-to-play scheme, and and what you might say, well, what's the evidence of that? The best evidence of it is that once she didn't become president of the United States and was no longer Secretary of State, all of a sudden, mysteriously, the donations seemed to dry up. Now, so if they were out doing all this important, necessary work, and all of it was advertised as necessary and important, why would the donations dry up once she ceased to be in a position of political influence? Well, of course, the donor base was based on people who were donating not with those goals in mind, but with the goal of winning favor with her. And sadly, that's been a fairly long-standing practice within what Donald Trump correctly called the swamp. Afghanistan, just real quickly, look, I mean, I've been involved in Afghanistan policy for about 30 years, starting with my support for Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was one of the great freedom fighters of the Cold War, drove the Soviets out of Afghanistan, played a very critical role in all of that with US support. His son now really potentially leading the resistance, or at least trying to force negotiations that would lead to some sort of sensible settlement. But I am immensely troubled, and let me say that my own perspective, to the extent it differs maybe a little bit with other conservatives, is I think I've thought through maybe 2 or 3 steps on this, and I'm beyond blaming Democrats or blaming the left, and I'm very much about saying, what are we doing? And to me, what is concerning is obviously every single step that Biden took on Afghanistan, all the way back to the air base abandonment in early July, where basically overnight, the Afghans woke up and the Americans were gone. Military equipment was still there, but
that to me, I mean, look, I'm a layperson, and to me, that was unforgivable. How is it that you leave? We have billions of dollars of worth of equipment, and you just left it there?
Right. And look, I realize Afghanistan's not something that most Americans wake up thinking about, but let me just put it in perspective geographically. This is an air base in Bagram that was 500 miles roughly from China, 400 miles, I believe, from Iran. So there are 2 major adversarial emerging threats to U.S. security. I mean, you would put them right at the top, and we have now essentially turned that base, which we put tens of millions of dollars into, constructed in the 1950s, into the hands of China's Communist Party, which now is basically assuming control of it, and I believe assuming control of the Taliban as well. Because the one thing I've said repeatedly about the Taliban is that they are so brutal in their human rights violations, so brutal in their war crimes, and so much of it is visual in the era of TV and video, that you almost never get around to their second biggest deficiency, and that is that they have no operational skills. The idea that the Taliban, these individuals they have selected, can actually manage and function as a governmental entity without foreign engagement is absurd. They have no
Yeah.
resources, and they don't have the operational skill set that's associated with the day-to-day, more mundane tasks of running social services, education, infrastructure, healthcare.
Mhm.
These are not areas of expertise at all.
No, not at all. I mean, you know, my little bit of knowledge with that, I say we should have kept the air base. I don't understand why
Yeah, I
we
agree
have
with you on
bases.
that.
I mean, we've been in Germany for since after World War II. We've been in
Right.
Korea since after the Korean War. Um, you know, why did, you know, I understand that Americans got tired of the war, but we weren't losing any soldiers. Basically, we would just support for the Afghani army. And you know, people criticize that we left, you know, that oh, the Afghan, like Biden said, oh well, you know, we didn't know they were going to quit. Well, when you were training them to use American air support and American military tactics, and you pulled those tactics,
Yeah.
what did you expect them to do? You didn't teach
Well,
them. You
and
didn't
it's not
teach
even
them to
just
fight.
it's not even just the long-term benefit of the airbase, but even in the evacuation. I mean, ponder really doing everything in reverse order. You know,
Yeah.
the value of that airbase in the evacuation itself would have been hugely beneficial. Kabul International Airport is basically one airstrip,
Mhm.
and the volume, the number of uh, um, cargo planes or commercial planes that you can move out of there in any given day is inherently limited. This is not John F. Kennedy Airport or
Yeah, I was going to say, have you ever been to
Heathrow or something like
have you
that.
ever been to Dallas? I'm
Yeah,
sure
of
you've probably been to
course,
Dallas.
many
So
times.
it's like trying to evacuate from Love Field when you have, you know, was it
Right.
Fort Hood, that's like 300 miles away, but you know, it's a military base. You could, you know, you have it more secure than you could have Dallas Love Field, that it's just a couple of small strips in the middle of Dallas.
Yeah, and so my concern is that getting to the point of saying that, you know, what's sort of new about this. I don't think there's anyone out there is defending Biden's actions. I have seen some people who absurdly are trying to put blame on Trump. Let me just say, as it relates to how former President Trump handled Afghanistan, I think it was pretty. He did a good job. I mean, you're looking at an agreement in the Doha Agreement that was all based on concrete steps that the Taliban were required to take. It was an agreement that was contingent on their abiding by certain acts, including not harboring terrorists or terrorist forces of any nature, and not being engaged in any military hostilities toward Americans. Of course, both were done in the final days.
Is it true? I don't know. I had heard a rumor. I don't know, that when Trump signed that agreement with the Taliban, that they tried to like kind of flex their muscles, and he like ordered an attack,
Look,
and they backed
in
down.
any negotiation, you're going to have gives and takes.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Otherwise, once we reached the conclusion, which was probably a conclusion we could have reached in October of 2001, when we first engaged in Afghanistan, that the Taliban had an insufficient amount of political support to ever govern the country successfully, but enough political support that the concept of eradicating them militarily, like you would say Al-Qaeda, or as he did largely with ISIS, wasn't possible. You're down to, as we were down to kind of with the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army, having to negotiate some sort of peace terms. And that's where, this Doha agreement was basically on the right path. And you would never have removed American troops, the final 2,500, with activist terrorist cells still operating in the country, and with the Taliban engaged in overt hostile military engagements toward the U.S. I mean, as you well know, with 13 Marines, dead as a result of really directly Biden's actions. And I don't want to say mismanagement, because I hear that word a lot on our side. I don't think, obviously, I don't agree with the policy designs of this administration in any way. Anything I see, I'm not seeing anything I really agree with, but I don't doubt that there's general competency. And, the idea of handing over military assets, for instance, is something we have 20 years of experience with. And this is the Pentagon of the United States of America, the largest and most powerful military in the history of the world. We know how to transfer a military asset, and you don't just, in the middle of the night, vacate with no handoff ceremony, no drawdown, no plan for removing the equipment. No.
Yeah, that to me, that was the one to me. I mean, how can you leave? They left night vision goggles. They left, was it a C4 or two C4s they left? I mean, the big cargo planes they left.
About $85 billion in high-end military equipment.
Yes.
And by the way, that's the other thing. You don't leave $85 billion of military equipment or $85 million in military equipment behind accidentally. And I realize that's a very unsettling statement, and it's something difficult really for a lot of Americans to get their arms around. But it does appear to me that whatever the motivating factor was in this handling of Afghanistan by Biden, it had very little to do with U.S. national security interests and very little to do with the future and people of Afghanistan. Those two seem to be very remote considerations, and it kind of brings me back to what I think was the original concern we raised during the campaign about what forces ultimately are driving this man's actions. Now, I might be wrong let me be fair, I might be wrong about that. But if I am wrong about that, you're talking about the entire, government of the United States, our entire military hierarchy being wrong on not one, two, or three decisions, but on a whole long litany of decisions. So you can envision a scenario where a mistake is made, where an error is made, where things don't play out exactly as you see. That's what makes this a high-end function, a difficult profession. But when you see a whole series of decisions, and in this case, easily well over 10, all in a row that contribute to the end that we ultimately have, you have to sort of ask yourself whether this wasn't really the intended result all along. And and that's been, by the way, let me just give you some further evidence of that. I mean, I was equally astonished when, in his first press briefings after the fall of Capitol, he's asked, what heads of state did you call to communicate with about this major geopolitical development, right? A country, the longest war in American history, 20 years, trillions of dollars that we'd invested into that war and into infrastructure in Afghanistan and the developmental needs of the country. And, over 2,500 American lives lost and a few thousand contractors. This was a very high-profile conflict and in a fairly strategic region of the world. I mean, you can argue that all areas of the world have some strategic value, but I mentioned the proximity to China. And
I mean, to me, Iran. That's our. I know people worry about Iran, but I worry. To me, our number one worry is China.
Just to this question of heads of state, that you've got Putin in Russia, Xi Jinping in China. You've got the Pakistanis who have a long-standing involvement. You've got our friends in India with Prime Minister Modi, who clearly have concerns with the Taliban, justifiable and understandable concerns. You've got Saudi Arabia that's had a long-standing stake in all. You don't put a phone call into any of those heads of state. You don't call Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom, who with hundreds of Britons who lost their lives in 20 years of sacrifice.
Well, look at what happened with in Australia.
The answer is no. The answer is no. He hasn't. Didn't make one of those phone calls. Didn't call one head of state anywhere, not friend, not foe.
Well, that's what I'm saying. But it's a pattern. It's a pattern with him, because you look at the submarine deal, the nuclear submarine deal they made with Australia. They totally left France out of the equation, because I know France was the one that was building their old ones, but France is an ally. You just
Yep.
undercutted them without even talking to them, and it's like, if Trump would have did something like that, the media would have been all up in arms. Oh, look, he's undermining our allies by, I don't know, just pick whatever they would have said if it was Trump who would have did something like that.
Well, I don't think we have any greater threat right now on the global scene than China's Communist Party.
Oh, yeah.
That threat, is like every box is checked on the threat list. You know what I mean? And we started out talking about trade and the unfair and illegal trade practices. We're now talking about a genocidal regime. 2 to 3 million Uyghurs in concentration camps. Never again is again happening. I'm astonished there too with how little real outrage is being expressed. I mean, it seems like there's a little bit of debate over whether or not we should participate in the Olympics. That has no equivalence to the magnitude of atrocities that are being committed in this region of China. And outrageously, just like it was the case with the pandemic itself, this is Xi Jinping, who given any opportunity, talks about globalism and cooperation. And then, they've kept out inspectors from all of these Uyghur camps. No UN, no UN Human Rights Council, no human rights groups, no American visits, just like they did with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where the only American who was allowed in, Peter Daszak, had years upon years of commercially conflicting ties with that institute, and was in many ways a sort of co-author of the whole gain of function research that they were conducting. So, to your broad question, like, where's the positive with Biden? I mean, I think there is none. I think you see this, by the way, emerging in the polling as well. I mean, he's collapsing.
Oh yeah, he's losing the. I mean, he wasn't going to lose.
It's become increasingly inconceivable to me that he does last 4 years. I mean, just on a political basis, I don't see how that happens.
Well, I would like to see if the Republicans do win the House. I hope they impeach him, because not because of the fact that because this is what they did to Trump, but there's legitimate reasons to impeach him, especially with what's going on with Hunter Biden, not this whole thing with the selling paintings. I don't know if you heard about they shared a bank account, and it's like, how do you share a bank account with your grown-up child? I don't.
Well, I mean, Hunter Biden's entire career is one of pay to play, all the way back to his first job in a bank in Wilmington, Delaware. You can track every single position that he's had has had something to do with correlating with his father's either his father's authority and power or his father's access to authority and power. And you would not logically put if it were Hunter Smith, he would not be on Burisma's board of directors. He would not be running a $1 billion plus private equity fund. All of these things, they're, by the way, predominantly is invested in by China's Communist Party, and then the Bank of China, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of China's Communist Party. Another fact that sadly doesn't get presented. I mean, we describe China wrongly as if it functions like our own country. I mean, they're really, while you do have a hybrid economy in China, everything is ultimately subjected to the state.
Yeah.
And in
the
fact,
guy who is it the guy that owns
even laws within China that require that. So basically, when the CCP says, we need this information or that information, or you need to go buy this company, or you need to sell this division, or you need to go illegally steal this intellectual property, it's not loyalty to the party, but loyalty to actually to the CCP's rule of law that requires. And that's the danger of what happens when you don't have a regimented separation of powers, and China does not have that. All power rests within China's country.
Yeah, that's what happened to what was it, the Alibaba guy who disappeared for a few months?
Jack Ma,
that he says something and the CCP didn't like it, so he disappeared, and he came back and was like apologetic or whatever.
Well, this is their methodology. I mean, they have and this goes all the way back to Mao, is that they have a zero tolerance basically for a deviation of thinking, whereas I mean, really, it's the complete opposite of the way our country functions. I mean, diversity of thought in the United States, at least historically, I don't know if
I was going to say
in the present tense, it's getting a little extreme, but it historically was, at least among people with goodwill, was considered a constructive development, right? You put two brains together, and the idea is you have, 1 + 1 = 3.
Well, it's
their outlook and vision is no deviation. And, I think you have within, so this is a country, 1.4 billion, just put it in perspective for you, 1.4 billion people. It's the most populated country in the world, though India is closely closing in quickly. I think there's about 90,000 members of China's Communist Party, and that's deceiving because there's probably a fraction of those who are real decision makers. So the terrifying aspect of being on top of the Chinese Communist Party right now is you have no mandate from the people to be governing that country. And you can see in province after province, we clearly saw this in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, we've seen it with the Uyghurs, seen it in Tibet, you see it in South Mongolia. You go through each one of these areas. It's just in many ways like the former Soviet Union. The only thing holding them to this in this satellite system is the People's Liberation Army and military force. In the absence of that, if you gave them a referendum on independence, I think literally just about every one of those provinces would choose to self-govern. They don't consider themselves communist. They don't subscribe to this this absurd president for life's vision on how they should be living and acting. And on every conceivable metric of wrongdoing, they are the worst in the world. So, we have a very vibrant environmental movement in the United States. It's partly funded by China's Communist Party.
And then they ignore
the largest polluter in the world is China's Communist Party, and they're never on the receiving end of any criticism for that.
No, not at all.
You get to human rights. You get to human rights.
Yeah, brought up Mao. So, and you were talking about how the free thinking and the diversity of thought in our country. I'm part of me, what I talk about sometimes, I talk about on my channel, I talk about basically what's kind of going on right now is that we're going through a cultural revolution. And
there's a lot of similarity. And
and I go, because I was reading up on it one time and it freaked me out because I was looking into, you ever heard of the Four Olds with Mao? And that's what's going on right now. They're, this whole thing with trying to change our country. The Four Olds are culture, customs, I'm trying to remember the other two. But basically, if you see what happened in Mao's China at that time, that's what's kind of going on right now. I look at it like a fifth column that's going on. That this, if we're not successful with this cultural revolution, if people are conservative, libertarians, we need to take the battle not just to, let's say, not just politically, because politically it's not going to win us anything. We need to take the battles. We need to go back into the universities. We need to go into culture, because if, they're beating.
Well, and we also need to, let's be honest, we also need to evaluate how, in the last 3 or 4 decades, every one of these institutions has fallen into very hostile hands on our watch. I mean, it seems to me to be very bothersome when I consider the fact that apparently there was no plan to protect academia from falling 95% into the hands of the globalist Marxist left. There was no plan to keep roughly the same 95% of, say, mass mainstream media out of the hands of more Democrat-leaning, globalist thinking mindset. No plan to deal with the purported deep state, which I think everybody now acknowledges exists, and which is so important in the sense that they're not really who they accountable to. I mean,
yes, it's funny. I find when
Trump's gone, they're still there.
Yeah, I find it funny when they go, "Oh, the deep state, that's a conspiracy theory," and I'm like, "Do you remember the interview that Schumer gave on?"
It's like, call it what you want, but the point is that you have this. We should just call it the bureaucracy. I think it's safe to. And let me just tell you, having worked in an administration, one of the biggest challenges was the fact that you have a bureaucracy that is going to outlive you as a political appointee. They're going to be there long after you're gone. They used to call Reagan an intern. That was a big joke to them.
Oh, wow.
And, in my observation, the problem was kind of just a lack of productivity, but they can slow things down. You get a lot of passive aggressive behavior. And they've historically been no friends. But the broader point is no one's elected them. Okay. And every time I hear someone point out the need for term limits, for instance, I bring this up because I'm very open-minded on that issue. It seems to generally make some sense. I don't think the idea of the founders was that people would be spending in 5 and 6 decades as members of Congress, and abusing essentially that privilege. They envisioned more of a citizen legislature. But even worse than that, at least those individuals, every 2 years if they're in the House, or every 6 if they're in the Senate, have to return home and face their voters and answer what they've done. Answer what they've done in the last term. That's not true of the bureaucracy, whatever you want to call it. These guys are names you wouldn't recognize for the most part, who are operating and functioning in really crucially important roles. And, with no matter what party's kind of in charge, they're still there. And it's one thing that, for all the progress Trump made, certainly has not been resolved and needs to be resolved. And it's not going to get resolved by this president either, sadly.
And even if Trump gets reelected, it's going to, he needs, Congress to be in lockstep with him to fix the problem. But if you're gonna, if you only have
one of the things, and we just briefly talked before we went on the air here about part of your mission and kind of addressing, our Hispanic and African American voter base, and the fact that, in my view, which I didn't get a chance to tell you this, but my view is the demographics of the Republican Party are shifting dramatically. We always should have been the party of Hispanic Americans and African Americans, but that brand identity was never really established. It is now, because I'll tell you who's being victimized by these open borders, who's being victimized by these vast, irrational spending plans, who's being victimized by the cost of the inflationary pressure. It's
I mean, like we're talking about
it's not the 1% that by and large are donors to the Democratic Party, right? I mean, you and I could go down the list of names that are part of America's 1%. You'd be hard pressed to find anyone in that category that is a overt Republican. You will find plenty of overt Democrat donors. Our voter base and our future lies with working men and women, and it is a cross-ethnic breed of Americans of all races and ethnicities. And I think I'm starting to see progress on it. And I've long wanted to make progress on it. But I think particularly on this border issue, it's becoming profoundly aware. They're becoming profoundly aware of the impact that they're having on crime, on the fentanyl and drug issue, which, by the way, is resurfacing again because it hits the two big issues that you asked me. What were the two big issues? I said China. China's Communist Party is on the move against the United States. Think, Khrushchev era. That's kind of where we are with Xi Jinping. And the second being the open border. I mean, this is fentanyl being manufactured in China and moved across our border and killing thousands upon thousands of Americans. And it tells you everything you need to know about why is it so important? It's so important because each one of those lives matters a whole lot. But it's also important because it tells you an awful lot about the mindset, about the thinking of the people that will not intervene and stop that. And you'll be, interested, just as a final note, I often, I assume this is true of anyone who's engaged on the national political scene. I get asked kind of how do you end up kind of walking down this path? And to me, there were two observations I made real early in life. And by early in life, I mean my late teens. I grew up in the Lehigh Valley watching Bethlehem Steel close down and the impact that that had on the community around me. I didn't have any immediate understanding of all of the grand macroeconomic and fiscal and trade policies at that point that were going into it, but I knew that we should be doing something and weren't. And then I attended the University of Miami in Florida, and some of my best friends were Cuban Americans. And I generally knew communism was a bad thing, but I hadn't really heard the graphic personal stories that at the age of 19, 20, I heard in great detail. And that made me a believer in kind of first the Make America Great Again agenda of American jobs first and foremost, and bring those jobs back to the United States. And it made me an anti-communist, which in turn made me a Reagan supporter and I think a human rights activist. I mean, I am not a bold neoconservative, looking to engage in every country in the world. I think that's way too ambitious and can cause problems. But I do believe that we have a special role in the world, and that when human life is unnecessarily threatened, as is the case, you say, here in Afghanistan, we have some obligations, particularly if we had a role in creating some of these problems, as clearly we did in Afghanistan.
Yeah, we
Which,
did.
by the way, I never got to my remedy on that, but my remedy is the Constitution of Afghanistan. If you go back to early 2004, that Constitution's adopted. Under that Constitution, when the president becomes unavailable to lead, as is the case right now, he's led the country, no sign of him coming back, the first vice president becomes the interim president and elections are scheduled. To me, the issue is, why are we not recognizing interim President Saleh in Afghanistan as the interim president, providing him with protection because he's in the north, in the Panjshir Valley. And I'm sure I know for a fact, let me just say that he's under a Taliban target.
Of course.
And providing the infrastructure necessary to hold this election that's called for under the Constitution, which doesn't require much, but it does require disarming the Taliban. because you can't be casting votes with people shooting machine guns in the streets. Now, those guys with machine guns should never have been able to occupy those governmental buildings. But my broader point on Afghanistan, and the reason I believe it's so important, is what an unbelievably dangerous precedent for us to set in the 21st century, that if you get enough arms and enough people willing to die for some cause, no matter how irrational or extreme that cause is, if you can take over a few buildings, we're going to rush to provide you with aid. We're going to show up when you raise the flag of whatever movement you're representing over those buildings and congratulate you on taking power. We should be doing the exact opposite. We should be filled with condemnation for the Taliban's war crimes on their way to Kabul, their vast human rights violations, recognizing under the Constitution the interim president in Saleh, and providing the sort of global support necessary to put this elected government back on track. I mean, what in it, 20 years to put together a functional constitution. By the way, over 500 Afghan men and women labored on that constitution and what was essentially the equivalent of a constitutional convention, with give and take and ultimately negotiation.
I'm also trying to remember how many the last 2 years, how many Afghan soldiers died fighting the Taliban. I think it was like 5,000 or 6,000 Taliban.
We've lost slightly under 3,000.
No, I know us, but I'm talking about the Afghani army.
Oh, it's huge numbers. This has been an unbelievably deadly conflict.
Because like I said, because the past couple of years, we've maybe lost like a handful of soldiers before the attack on the Kabul airport, but thousands of Afghani soldiers were dying fighting the Taliban for the past, I think, I forgot where I read, like 3 or 4 years or something like that. The U.S. military was just playing a support role to the Afghani army. They weren't really going into like the active firefight areas.
Well, there's a lot of questions that need to be asked and answered as it relates to the final weeks of a democratically elected government in Afghanistan. And one of them that I'm continuing to hear about is the Afghan army not being paid, purportedly all the way back to April in some cases. So that all needs to be investigated. I mean, clearly, when the rubber hit the road and they needed to step up to defend the country, they didn't do it. On the other hand, in fairness to them, we kind of left them the first time in that situation. It's true that they were trained by Americans, but they were trained to fight with Americans, not on their own.
Exactly.
That's the difference between Frisbee football and tackle football.
No, that's what I had heard. It's like, when we left, we pulled the air support. So they were used to fighting, they'd get into a firefight and they'd call in the air support, and there was nobody to come in and help them with the air support. So of course, how are you going to win when you're trained one way? Like you said, if you're playing, someone's playing checkers, and they're used to playing chess. I mean, they're used to playing chess, and all of a sudden, no, now you're playing check. Now you got to play checkers.
Well, no, and ponder the fact that one of the most important currencies that we have as a global force is our credibility, which is to say our word and our reliability, that when we say we're going to do something, we're going to do it. That's never been more meaningful in the last few decades than it is right now. I'd have to go back to the Cold War, really. But look at Taiwan, look at India, look at the South China Sea, look what's going on in Latin America and Africa, which is being totally underreported, and the magnitude of CCP engagement and this Belt and Road Initiative, which is described as an economic development plan. Ultimately, it's a monopolistic military plan that would preclude us from entering, certain very important valued trade routes essential for us to function as an economy. And you can see this with what's manifesting right now in the so-called supply chains, right? I mean,
well, you know, with
I
the,
don't
with
want
the,
I don't want Americans to be confused on this either. I mean, when we talk about supply chain, we need to be making products
well,
and
that's what I was going to say.
providing
It's,
them in
you know, what,
America with American workers. The benefit of that is the reliability of it. Okay. And we have gotten way off path as it relates to reliance on countries, any degree of reliance, even in a friendly country, even with a friendly country that we have with communist China, would be unhealthy.
Well, look at what's going on with the chips in Taiwan. We, you know, they're our friend right now, you know, and if China decides to try to attack them, for, you know, people, they're worried about shortages right now. You know, right now there's a shortage in cars, electronics, all because of the chips that are made in Taiwan.
Well, that's one of the main
And
motivating forces and factors that's going on in all of this, and it is absolutely incumbent on the United States of America to make sure that Taiwan's independence be maintained and defended, right? And that's no easy. That's not an easy undertaking because it's not like, say, NATO, where we have that kind of agreement. But that's one of the reasons that, for instance, that support for Australia is important. The support for Japan is important. Support for South Korea is important, because the one good thing going for us in this hostile bilateral relationship, it's frankly been hostile for long before we have decided to describe it overtly as hostile.
yeah, I mean, they've been stealing our
intellectual on their side for long. Like people say Trump started the trade war. No, the trade war was going on. It was just a one-way war.
They've been stealing our intellectual properties.
Defending ourselves.
They've been stealing our intellectual properties for decades with no consequences.
What I was going to say is the one thing that is positive is that though they're the largest country in the world with 1.4 billion people, they have no real solid allies. Okay, they have North Korea, which operates almost like a colony state. They're developing rapport with Iran. What do all these countries have in common? They're just colossal violators of human rights. They have no democratic governance. They're not accountable to their people. They're engaged in domestic and global abuses of all sorts. The idea, going back to Reagan in the 80s, of a battle between good and evil, that we all confidently described the world as being engaged in at that time, was accurate. And I think we can pretty safely say that we're once again into a global conflict between good and evil. And this time, you know, the evil is clearly, you can identify it in some of these states that I've mentioned, but you can also identify it in our own country. We've allowed it to infiltrate. We've abandoned these principles. It's one of the reasons we started our Tea Party movement with such a simple, grouping of messages, including adherence to our Constitution and founding principles, was that once you abandon that, there's no constraint really on how far off the rails a country can go. And we clearly, in a number of respects, have abandoned that.
Yeah, no, that's why I said earlier, I had said, but we also still need to fight, not just because the Tea Party movement was a political movement, but we also need, like Ben Shapiro and the Daily Wire, they're doing movies. They did one movie, they're gonna be doing more movies. You got like Glenn Beck and Blaze TV. I think he said he's going to start doing movies, but you need to do like TV shows, music, culture. To you also
I'm with you on
into
that generally, but let me just also say, I think I don't know what we've been talking. You and I haven't ever talked about November 3 or what your view is on it, but You know, we haven't shown an ability to do the most basic things operationally in American politics, like run a free and fair election.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So we got 6 states with monumental concerns.
Our state
And
being one of them.
and we got a lot. When I look at this movement, we got a lot of people focused on that kind of component of it. We can always use more, but this is one of my concerns: is that you know, what is the metric under which we measure wins and losses? I mean, you know, it does ultimately come down to is our ideological vision for liberty and a free and fair and prosperous America one that's in governing authority, or is it one that's an opposition force? So clearly an opposition force right now. Well, we only become an opposition force because we're losing.
Yes.
And I really think we need to get back to those metrics. And when people engage in this profession, it needs to be a collective undertaking, meaning we all need to understand, you know, where we are in this stratosphere of trying to keep the country on track, and we need to hold ourselves accountable.
But I was going to say that's the problem with, you know, right-leaning libertarian conservatives. We're not very good collectivists. You know,
and it's getting worse and worse. I mean, I think when I first became engaged in the 1980s, I would be surprised when I ran across people that were politically active but were sort of isolationist in their approach. You know, because this is kind of a social. It is a collectivist undertaking, but that's become more and more common. And you know, you need to have a leadership that is accessible and that is strategic and that is developmental in their approach. You know, meaning we one of the great losses, we had this whole generation that was lost. You know, sort of in the 90s to the left, when we apparently just stopped paying attention to younger people's viewpoints, while the far left was putting a lot of focus on it.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, it's like I was a Democrat until like probably around 2001. And the person who woke me up to the ideas of like liberty was Ron Paul. I think Ron Paul did a great job in the early 2000s in waking up a lot of people to the ideas of liberty, the Constitution, you know, sound money. And I thank him for my awakening, because that was when I was like, you know, this stuff doesn't make sense. What's going on?
He and I are fraternity brothers, Lambda Chi Alpha.
Oh, nice. I would love to, you know, I would love to talk to him and thank him for my my awakening. I mean, I'm a big fan of his son. He actually he was my first choice in 2016. Was Rand, and then Ted Cruz.
Rand Paul's a very bright guy, and he's done an exceptional job, particularly, you know, over the last few months, you know, with the questioning of Fauci and whatnot. I mean, very important, you know. So he's on the right track on a lot of these issues. He's another one who took the Hunter Biden issue sufficiently seriously, and I think he referred that Senate report to the Department of Justice, which I don't even know if that Senate subcommittee was intending to do that. And I'm, you know, I don't know what's going on with that. I'm going to assume nothing, but you know, at least that information has been presented, and I think he's done a very good job, and particularly a few of these core areas in holding this administration accountable. And in some ways, you know, when you're out of power, you can only do two things. You can do your best to hold the governing administration accountable, and you can offer proactive policies like the one I just mentioned on Afghanistan. So this idea, you know what, I've run this by a few people. They're like, well, the Taliban would never go for it. I'm like polling the Taliban on their view as it relates to this. We're the most powerful country in the world, right? And we just had a 20-year war there. This idea that we have no influence, that we're just, you know, we just resigned to turning this over to a bunch of thugs is absurd. It's absurd. It's utterly absurd. And I'm not an advocate of saying we need to be there indefinitely or anything of that nature. But this idea that this was and this was an outcome that was in essence inevitable is ridiculous. It was not an inevitable outcome. It was a highly preventable outcome.
Well, we could have did
one that this whole 20-year war was basically largely about.
Well, you could have kept you could at least kept the base and sign like what's they called as an STR, the strategic. The leap had
it's a lease. It's basically a lease
yeah,
agreement
yes.
that you have, and it's one like we've done, and we did it in the Philippines with Subic and with Clark Air Base and whatnot. There's always options available. The idea that we had to pick up and leave in the middle of the night was not option 1, 2, or 3 in my view, and it's an absolute curiosity really as to what's motivating these decisions. And they're just, it's like one after another that are just designed to diminish this nation and diminish its power, its prestige, its credibility, ultimately its influence and its economic standing. And the magnitude of impact with inflationary pressures and where this economy is going now over the next few months is immensely concerning. And to see in key sectors like in law enforcement or in fire departments or even in education, individuals who are not going to comply, do not want to comply, should have the right not to comply with these mandates. Leaving or quitting are going to leave even greater numbers of gaps.
Well, yeah, they want to
in key sectors to the point where it really becomes an unsettling national situation with a country that becomes increasingly unstable. And I think all of these steps, and so many of them stemming from the pandemic, just thoughtless. I mean, I can't name one thing Fauci's been right on.
Well, I was going to say, it's just, it's kind of like what, when Biden was vice president, what did Obama say? They wanted to fundamentally change the country. And Biden pretty much said the same thing. He said he wanted to fundamentally transform the economy. And,
well, the reality of what we're confronting seems to me to be even more terrifying than that, because, I think to each person fundamentally transforming America, I think I understood what that meant. I don't know if you've gone through your transition yet, but we all knew what that meant. A lot of Americans didn't. And
well, I say it like this. I've said this in my videos before I go. When you can't say that you love something and say you want to fundamentally change something, because if you love this country, you can't say you want to fundamentally change it, because then to fundamentally change it is creating something else.
We have issues that are deep and serious enough that you can say that they require a fundamental sort of overhaul but your general principles, right? I mean, the first thing I made note, even in your describing the Tea Party movement, is controversial. I was about to point out, that's a euphemism for the far left, for successful.
No, I agree with. I agree with that.
But I know you do. But you know what made it controversial? The fact that in 2010, 2 years into his 8-year term, we denied Barack Obama 6 years of governance that they felt they were entitled to. And then in 2014, we came back and took the Senate. And with all of our populist designs, kind of laid the foundation for a populist presidential run in 2016. And still, when you look at all of these endeavors that are going on, whether it's these great moms that are showing up at these school boards, confronting elected school boards about unjustifiable policies,
I've been
or
there. I can.
whether it's the election audits ongoing in states, they're being ordered by elected officials who are sufficiently concerned. I mean, this was one of the things that came out of the Navarro reports, is that you had individuals who were like, no, this election was, there was no fraud in it. And you would go, and that team would go and present all of this detail. And by the time they get out of that meeting, they would say, I had no idea. This is unbelievable. And that's where these audit.
Well, what's the funny thing is, you don't even need to go, you don't even need to get nefarious with it. You don't even need to go, oh, well, votes, let's say, too many people voted in this county, not enough people vote. Just to see how things were kind of rigged, so to speak. Just look at Mark Zuckerberg and the money he spent, not for campaigns, but he spent money to promote, Democrats to go vote and all that stuff. That money that they don't have to account for.
To be specific, he funded activities that were not authorized by the state legislatures that are under the state constitutions empowered to run these state elections. So say this idea of drop of voter boxes. On the surface, you present them, you say, hey, we're in the middle of a pandemic. It's more difficult for people to get to their voting booths. Okay, that might make sense. If it makes sense, you put a bill together, even if you have to do it on an emergency basis, and you run it through your state legislatures. That's what the state constitution calls for.
Yep.
You don't cut a deal between a governor or a secretary of state and the Democratic Party, like they did in Georgia, and just go out and start putting these things. And then, oh, by the way, they just turn up in Democrat precincts and in areas. What I'm saying, though, is that all of these changes, whether it's confronting these mask mandates and the vaccine mandates on kids, where the mortality rate is like practically zero, and where these masks and the vaccines themselves remain experimental in essence. That opposition is coming from the grassroots, it's coming from the people. On the audits, whatever you think of it, whether you feel everything was secure and perfect or not, I find that most people who think it was perfect haven't taken the time to read a whole lot of these reports like the Navarro.
I think even
just to my broader point isn't really about the outcome of that, but where's the pushback coming from? Is it coming from the Beltway? Is it coming from even Republican? No, it's coming from the grassroots, which is one of my big messages. If we're going to win this battle, don't speculate. It's not about speculating over who's going to be, the 2024 nominee of the Republican Party.
Yeah, I'm not even worried about 2024 yet.
This is even 2022. This is about organization and inspiration and strategy, basically those three things, because I do believe in this country of 330 whatever million that we have, that the people are still with us when they understand the stakes and when they understand the facts. So it's education, and then it's inspiration, but then it's engagement. And just the final point, like when I go back and look at 2009 and I say, well, how do we mobilize tens of millions of Americans? I mean, 30, 40 million Americans participated in some capacity in the American Tea Party movement. How do you go about doing that? If someone asked me, to me, it was a supply and demand opportunity. Because if you woke up tomorrow and you really believed, as I believe you believe, and as I believe, that the country's future is on the line and you wanted to do something about it, the avenues available to you are through the Republican Party are very limited. In fact, I'm sure you've seen in these the biggest example of, say, the precinct project, right? Where I think you have 400,000 precinct chairs in the country, only 200,000 are filled. So half of these precinct chairs in the Republican National Committee are not filled. That's data, by the way, a few months old. Maybe they've made progress since then. But let me just say, do you hear every day them telling you, hey, we need more precinct chairmen, please get involved? No, you're not hearing that, because that's not the way institutions trying to defend a status quo act. But that would be one of the messages we should be putting out, is if you want to get involved, go, look, the first thing you should do is go see who is your precinct chairperson. And you might well find it's been vacant for years, maybe decades. These are the kind of examples that we need to be identifying and pursuing. And this is the way you ultimately, I think, prevail. And by prevail, I don't mean force our will on others.
No.
I mean to allow the will of the people to manifest in a way that it naturally would, because I don't think, and it's reflecting in all of these polling numbers, that you see anything that the American people are liking in the Biden administration, except, hey, he's not sending out mean tweets. And pretty soon people are going to be begging for mean tweets, I think.
Oh, my sister is a Democrat, and she voted for Biden. And like the other day, I told her, I said, with the gas prices the way they are, and now that you know everything that you see that's gone on the past couple of months, would you have still voted for Biden? And she said, no.
Okay.
And I was like, you know what? There's hope.
We can't blame her. You can't blame her. We got to blame us. Okay.
No, yeah.
So where were we in making that argument? I mean, I did my best.
Oh, I tried to.
Many people did their best, but what we did was obviously not enough. And we have to take responsibility for that. This is one of the great deficiencies, I believe, of the conservative movement generally, and of even of the party, is to point the fingers at the other side for their success. I mean, yeah, it was a lot of these acts, like what you just mentioned with Zuckerberg, and the list goes on, by the way, was unethical. Some of it was downright fraudulent. Almost none of it, by the way, has been corrected. I mean, and you can go out to see, just take Nevada as one example. Why have individuals, who voted in Clark County but don't live in Nevada, but used to, but got ballots anyway? Why have those votes not been backed out of the totals? Why in Georgia, with all of those numbers of underage voters, which clearly were fraudulent, they weren't cast by 16 and 17-year-olds, why have those not been backed out? I think the answer is they don't want to build momentum that shows progress toward a possible reversal of some of these electoral colleges. But the reality is, whatever your perspective, whatever your viewpoint, and whoever you voted for and whatever party you're registered under, there needs to be accuracy. And when we identify clearly illegal votes, those need to be backed out of the totals and corrected.
Yeah.
And you got to start with the question, why? Forget who won this. Don't even allow the big picture to confuse anyone. Why have those small steps not been taken? And again, the easiest thing is to blame those who perpetuated those incidents. But I think the more proper thing to do is to ask, what are we doing about it?
Yeah, it's one thing to just blame Democrats. It's easy to play the blame game, but we got to be able to take action on our side. We can't just go, oh, well, they did this and they did that. Well, you know what? Now it's, what are we going to do in response to be able to fix the situation? You can't just always put the blame. You got to put solutions, like you're talking about right now. Putting, what solutions are we going to take in order to make things better moving forward? Because we can't change 2020, but
because we're really starting to deal with some core areas. And let's just take healthcare with the position on the therapeutics, right? These therapeutics should have been the decision of physicians on their use. Many of them had, long records of off-label use. All right. So instead, we're doing vaccines that, forget off-label vaccines. These vaccines largely have not even been FDA approved for this indication yet, as they're experimental, with one exception. And the therapeutics themselves, some of them date back to the 50s
Mhm.
and have been used successfully. The care of a patient should always be something between the treating physician, primary care or specialist,
Mhm.
and that patient, not a bureaucrat in Washington who hasn't seen
Mhm.
that patient or isn't
Well, it's like
aware of all the,
that's what happened with Joe Rogan with
well, and this is the danger ultimately of a this is the danger of single payer systems is you know the money drives the system,
Mhm.
and when the money is all in the hands of government's going to drive decision making on what is and is not covered, and that's the last situation that any American should want. But
No.
I think that sort of general sense applies to almost all of these sectors and all of these issues that we're confronting, is that we, you know, we need a government of the people that is respectful of these individual God-given liberties that are at the core of the revolution and the founding of our nation. And, you know, the greatest success story, frankly, that the world's ever seen as far as the country goes.
Mhm. Mm. I think it's a good place to end it. Um, well, thank you for coming. This just so you can know, so this goes on Rumble and YouTube. If you're following me, I'm the right Rican, and um, Michael Johns, you're almost on everything. um, but I know you have a link tree that I'll put your link tree on the description so people can follow you. Which social media do you like to use the most?
Well, you can find me on Twitter with my name, one word, Michael Johns. I'm on YouTube, my name, one word,
Mm.
Michael Johns, and Facebook, Michael Johns. Tea Party is my page. And on the conservative friendly ones, I'm generally on there with my name, one word. So
Okay. All
thank you
right.
very much, sir.
Well, thank you for like I said, thank you for coming on, and hopefully I'll have you on again when I'd love to have you on again when there's like especially when there's like a breaking story, so like that we could sounds like we'd have a good discussion on it.
Keep in touch. Thank
All
you.
right. Have a good one.